One of the things that I love about the gathering is that you guys are really different. Like, I don't say that in a bad way, right? But you're different from each other. So we've got a lot of people from lots of different backgrounds, different experiences. They've come from different kinds of churches, and we try to honor that as much as we can. So we're going to do something tonight that we've actually never done since I've been here. So that's been about 12 years or so. But we are going to have a hymn sing. And this is not like we're going to take the old hymns and set them to new music and play guitars and stuff. This is like a legit hymn sing with hymnals, all right? And we'll say, people can shout out their number. Like, I want to sing, number 432, and we'll sing the first, second, and fourth stanza. And if you don't know what a stanza is, maybe this isn't for you. But if I said stanza and your heart fluttered a little, maybe this is for you, all right? So 6 o'clock tonight right here for a good old-fashioned hymn sing. If you want to be part of that, you are welcome to do so. Some of you guys remember a few weeks ago, we had our every 10-year hurricane come through, which happens about every 10 years. We get a hurricane that comes through, and I think this one was named Helene. And that was on a Friday, and it just so happened it was the same Friday that we were moving from one house to another. Now, fortunately, we had moved all of the big stuff on Thursday, and so Friday was Box Day. Unfortunately, I was doing Box Day by myself. And so, it was like carrying the boxes in from the truck, all in like 80-mile-an-hour winds, and a downpour that hasn't been seen since Noah. And in the middle of all that, we lost power. And some of y'all lost power with us. Most of you did not lose power as long as we did. You get those updates. It's like, 80% of Montgomery County has their power back, and 85% of the Dayton area has their power back. We were at 99% of customers have their power back, and we still didn't have ours, which I just thought makes us 1%ers, which is kind of cool. All right, we may never get that again. But what that meant is that night we found ourselves in a new house, not unpacked, boxes everywhere, dogs in a complete panic, and no light anywhere because our flashlights were where? Well, we didn't know. Our candles were somewhere. They're in a box somewhere. We were able to find one flashlight to get around. And you can imagine that this was a little bit of a stressful time, right? A little bit of anxiety going on. This is frustrating. A lot of emotions that we're processing in all of this. Because the reality is there was a lot going on that was outside of our control. We did not invite the hurricane to come. We did not want the power to go out. We couldn't control any of that, but we found ourselves in this place where we have to choose how to respond. Because in life, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond. And we could have chosen to respond with the attitude of despair, right? Oh, poor me. Why does everything always happen to me? This is awful. This is the worst thing ever. We're never going to get power back. It's never coming back on, right? And maybe this is how some of you respond to these kinds of things. Maybe you know people who respond this way. That's one choice. We didn't make that choice. Mary Ann said, you know what, I'm going to go do something about this. And she went to Target, and she found these camping lanterns that you could charge in your car, right? So they had a USB port, so we could charge them up in the car, and then we had little lanterns, and I went and I found my little headlamp out in the garage, and so now I'm walking around the house like a miner. And every time I look at Mary Ann, she does this. But at least I could see, right? The reality in life is whenever you experience stuff that is out of your control, you cannot change what's happening to you, but you can choose your attitude and you can choose your action. And here's the equation that this is a general life principle. Your attitude plus your action equals your life's outcomes. Okay? This isn't like a Bible principle. This is just a general life principle. You've seen this, you know this makes sense to you, and it's something that's good to remember. But I want to suggest this morning that there's a missing part of this equation. And when we grasp that missing part of this equation, it's even more helpful for us. The missing part is this, that God is in control and that God provides. And when my attitude and my actions are centered around the truth that God provides, that really changes everything. And so for this morning, our big idea that I want us to focus on is this. When my attitude is gratitude and my actions are generous, I will experience God's provision, and the outcome will be growth. All right? We're going to look at a story from the New Testament that kind of reinforces this principle of spiritual growth, because at the end of the day, what I want for you, more than almost anything else, is I want you to grow in your faith. I want you to grow to know Jesus more, to love Jesus more. I want you to look more like him in the way that you live. And I really do believe that your spiritual growth, the growth in your faith, will largely be determined by the attitudes you choose and the actions that you choose. All right? So if you have your Bible, open them to John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Little background on this passage. In the Bible, we've got 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar. So if you read through all of them, you'll see that they really tell almost all of the same Jesus stories. But John is quite different. The reason was that John wrote his gospel much later, and he really kind of wrote it to fill in some of the gaps. So some of the things that he includes, the other 3 don't have. And some of the things the other 3 have, and John was like, well, you guys see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I don't need to tell you about it again. But every so often we find one of these stories where John includes it and Matthew, Mark, and Luke include it. And when that happens, we should say, hey, this one must be really important. If all 4 of those guys thought we needed to look at this one, we should really pay attention to it. This is one of those, right? So this story is told in all 4 Gospels, but we're going to pick it up in John chapter 6, verse 5. It says, lifting up his eyes, this is Jesus, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? So Jesus and his disciples see this big old group of people coming at them, which was not a new experience. Jesus was kind of growing in fame, and people wanted to see him. They wanted to hear him. They wanted to see some of his miracles. And so almost everywhere he went at this stage, a large crowd would gather. And Jesus sees the large crowd. Some of the other Gospels tell us that he had compassion on them. And he says to Philip, hey, we need to feed these people. How can we do that? Now, Jesus actually already knew the answer to this question, didn't he? Because he's God and he knows all things. He actually knows how he's going to feed them. He knows where it's going to come from. He knows all of this. And so he's asking Philip this not because he doesn't know, but because he wants Philip to think about this. And he wants to see how Philip is going to respond here. Because look, they've got a situation that's out of their control. A large crowd is gathered and they need to be fed. They can't control that. So Philip, how will you respond here? What will your attitude be? What will your actions be? And let's see what Philip says. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii, that would be like 200 days' wages. All right, so that's almost a full year's salary. So he says, 200 denarii worth of bread. So, you know what? I'll take my whole annual salary, head to Panera, and buy everything that I can. That's what Philip is saying. That would not be enough for each of them to get a little. So it's just, think of how big a crowd this must be, right? If you spent your annual salary at Panera, how much bread would you get? How many bagels, muffins, cookies, whatever would you get? And what Philip is saying, even if we did that much bread, that's only going to give everybody just a little bit. What Philip is expressing here is an attitude that I would call a not enough attitude. And a not enough attitude focuses on what I lack. He sees the situation, and all he can see is what he doesn't have. And maybe you know someone who approaches problems this way. Something difficult comes into their life, something hard comes into their life, and their immediate response is, I don't have enough. I can't deal with this. I can't do this. I don't. This is terrible. This is the end. And the reality is, when we take a not enough attitude, where that leads us is into a place of stress and anxiety. Because if everywhere I look, all I see is what I don't have, I begin to worry whether or not I'll have what I need. And I begin to worry whether or not I have enough or I am enough. And this can lead us into a really dark spiral if we allow it. And so Philip is really a warning for us to say, what attitude do you take when tough times come? Do you just focus on what you don't have? Because it's so easy to do this, isn't it? In so many parts of life, to compare ourselves to others. And instead of not just saying, well, what don't I have? It's, well, they have stuff that I don't have. When I drive through a neighborhood where all the houses are bigger than mine, or all the cars are faster than mine, or if I go to the store and everybody's clothes are better than mine, or when I'm at work and I look around and I know what other people are making and it's a lot more than me, isn't it easy to compare myself to others, to look around at others and say they have more than me, I don't have enough, I'm missing out on something, and now I go into this place of anger, of selfishness, of greed, of covetousness, because I want what they have, because they have what I don't have. And so we have to watch ourselves. That the attitude that we take is not an attitude like Philip's of not enough, but we take a different kind of attitude. And actually, one of Jesus' other disciples shows us how to do this. So if we keep going into verse 8, it says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here. Now, I'm going to stop right here. Cool thing about Andrew. Almost every time we see Andrew in the Bible, he's bringing someone to Jesus. So if you go back and you look at all of the different times we see Andrew in the Bible, he's almost always bringing somebody to Jesus. Wouldn't it be cool if that's what you were known for? Like, I don't know much about that person, but every time I see him, they're bringing somebody to Jesus. What a cool thing. Has nothing to do with our story today, but just a cool thing. All right, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? Now, I want you to see 2 things that Andrew does here that are so helpful. The first thing is, instead of focusing on what he doesn't have, he looks at what he has. That's not what he has, it's what someone else has, but that someone else is willing to contribute it to the cause. And I would say that what Andrew has that's different than Philip is Andrew has a gratitude, a grateful attitude. His attitude is to say, I'm going to look at what I have, and then I'm going to ask myself a question, what can God do with this? Because isn't that what he says to Jesus? He says, Jesus, look, I don't have much. In fact, I don't have anything but this little guy here. He's got a little bit, but I don't know what you can do with that. But here it is. Sometimes in life, we think we only have a little bit. But what we're going to see in just a second is that when we have a little bit and we're willing to give it to Jesus, he can do an awful lot with it. See, nobody expected what Jesus is going to do. Nobody expected Jesus to do this amazing miracle, this amazing act of provision. But Philip's never going to see it because all he sees is what he doesn't have. But Andrew, because he's simply willing to focus on what he has, sets in motion this activity that's going to be amazing, that's going to be faith-building for a lot of people. I know sometimes it can be hard to focus on what we have. Because sometimes when we focus on what we have, we still look at it and say, well, that's not enough. But you see, this is the power of gratitude. Gratitude is my willingness to say, you know what, instead of focusing on what I don't have or what I want and don't have, I'm going to focus on what I have. And I'm simply going to say thank you to God for what he has given me. Now, I know that there are times when you don't feel like being grateful. Right? Like something happens in your life that was unexpected. Life throws you a curveball. Someone mistreats you. Someone says something difficult to you. A hurricane blows through and knocks out your power for 5 days. I get that there are times when you don't feel like being grateful. But even in those hard times, even when it feels like you don't have enough or you've only got a little bit, I want to remind you that you have way more than you think. In fact, let me give you 3 words that can help you be grateful even when it's difficult. All right? The first is, I want you to think about God's protection. Because God has protected you. Some of you actually have probably pretty amazing stories about how God has protected you. Some event happened in your life that was completely unseen and you didn't know it was coming, but God stepped in and did an amazing act of protection. Some of you don't have a story like that. That doesn't mean God's not protecting you. Most of the time, we don't know about God's protection because he's protected us. We don't know what might have happened or what could have happened. All of us can understand that God has protected us sometimes from the consequences of our own foolishness. Because every single one of us has made foolish decisions. We've made mistakes. And very often we can look back and say, man, God really protected me from experiencing the full consequence of those mistakes. God protects us. And when we focus on God's protection, that's a reason to be grateful. Even more than that, we can focus on God's provision. Because God has already provided everything that you need. And maybe you're more prone to look at what you don't have, and if you look at what you don't have, it's hard to see that God has provided everything you need. But the reality is you're here this morning. And you know what that tells me? That tells me you had a way to get here. That tells me that you probably were able to sleep last night. You're all dressed, and I appreciate that. But that means that God has provided clothes for you, right? Like the bare essentials of life, you have them. You have clothes, you have food, you have a roof over your head. God has provided everything that you need. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in seeing what other people have and doing the comparison game that we miss out that God has provided everything that I need. And sometimes the best thing that we can do is just take a minute and think about how God has provided all of my needs. But I want to suggest there's one other reason why we should be grateful. God's protection, God's provision, but also God has prospered you. God has not just provided for your bare essentials. He has given you He has given you way more than you need, right? If you're not sure that God has prospered you, think this through. Do you live in a house that has more than one bathroom? If so, then God has prospered you. Do you have enough clothes that you can go 3 days in a row and not wear the same outfit? Then God has prospered you. When you drink your water, do you even think for a minute about the fact that it's clean? Then God has prospered you. Do you have one room in your house that's dedicated to just holding stuff that you never use? Then God has prospered you. If your garage is so full that you can't get your car into it, then God has prospered you. If you have a garage, then God has prospered you. Do you get this? If you're renting a storage unit because you have so much stuff it doesn't fit in your house, then God has prospered you. Think about what you have that most of the world doesn't have. God has given us so much. And instead of focusing on what I don't have or what I lack or what someone else has, what I need to do is focus on what God has already provided, what He's already given me, because it is so much. And this is a grateful attitude. And a grateful attitude changes your outlook on life. Because you begin to realize how much you have and how much God has done for you. And you begin to say to yourself, if God has done this much already, what more can He do with what I have? So even though maybe I feel like I've only got a little bit and I'm thankful for it, now the next question is the question that Andrew has. But Jesus, what can you do with this? What can you do with this? Well, Andrew's about to find out. Verse 11. Jesus then took the loaves, and when He had given thanks, love that phrase. Right? Think about this. Who is Jesus thanking? Who made those fish? He did. Who made the wheat and all the other materials that went into making those loaves of bread? He did. But it's not like He's going to be arrogant and be like, well, thank you to me, right? But He's thanking the Father, and I think the reason that Jesus gives thanks here is to remind us to give thanks for everything. And so Jesus gives thanks. And when He had given thanks, He distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. This is one of those miracles I so wish I could have seen. How did this even work? So Jesus has, two fish, and He's got 5 loaves. And He starts taking the bread and just breaking it and passing it out, right? Here's some for you, here's some from you, here's some for you, here's some for you, Philip. You shouldn't have doubted me. Here's some for you. He just starts handing out. Now remember how many people were there. A year's wages at Panera wouldn't have fed them. But Jesus just keeps on passing it out. And the disciples are looking like, well, He's got to be out now. Look, and He's still got the same amount. What in the world is going on? And then He takes the fish, and He starts passing the fish out. Now, I wonder sometimes, once Jesus gave thanks for these fish and blessed them, did they become holy mackerel? Yeah. Verse 12, and when they had eaten their fill, He told His disciples, gather up the leftover fragments. Are you grasping the enormity of this miracle? 5 loaves, 2 fish, and there's leftovers. And they had eaten their fill. Like everybody got as much as they want. Like I'm sure there were people there, right? Like the teenage boys, hey, can I have some more? I need some more. I need a fourth helping, please. And they got everything they wanted. They got to eat their fill, and then there's leftover. Gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. You see, God's provision is always more than enough. Nobody saw this coming. So that morning, that little boy, I don't know what his name was. Let's call him John. John says, "Hey, Mom, I'm gonna go see Jesus today." All right. He starts to run out the door, and Mom says, "Hold on, Johnny. You need to take a lunch." And Johnny says, "Oh, come on, Mom. Nobody else is taking a lunch," which was true. Nobody else brought a lunch. And Mom says, well, no son of mine is going out of the house without a lunch. So she packs him a quick Lunchable, right? Here's some bread and some fish. Take this with you. Now that was just a little bit. All Johnny's mom did was provide enough. Here, this is just enough for you. All Johnny had was a little bit. And probably for a growing boy, it wasn't even enough to fill him, but it was enough to kind of stave off the hunger. So he's got a little bit, and his mom gave him just enough. But in the hands of Jesus, what we think is just enough and what we think is a little bit can become amazing and can bless so many people. Nobody saw this coming, but God's provision is always more than enough. And if you think you've only got a little bit, and if you think you only have enough, I want you to understand that that little bit that you have is more than enough in the hands of Jesus. So let's go back to our big idea for the morning. When my attitude is gratitude and my actions are generous, I will experience God's provision, and the outcome will be growth. Let's walk through the story and see this, right? So Andrew and Philip had a choice to make. They had a choice to make about their attitude. When posed with a difficult situation where it seemed like there was no good solution, Philip chose to focus on what he didn't have. Andrew chose to focus on what he had and simply ask Jesus, "What can you do with this?" The little boy, who only had a little bit, had a choice to make. He could choose to take his little bit and hold on to it tightly, because it was only a little bit, and keep it for himself, because, hey, the rest of you should have brought a lunch. Or he could give it to Jesus and see what could happen. Andrew chose an attitude of gratitude. The little boy chose the actions of generosity. And the result was that both of them experienced God's provision, but not just them, right? A whole massive crowd of thousands of people experienced God's provision. Even Philip experienced God's provision, because Andrew and the little boy made the right choices. And this became a faith-building experience for many. Look at how it wraps up in verse 14. It says, when the people saw this sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When they saw what Jesus did, when they saw God's provision, they believed in Jesus. That's what it means when they said this is a prophet that is coming to the world. This is our Messiah. This is the one prophesied by the Old Testament. This is God come to earth. That's who Jesus is. Because they saw God's provision, their faith was built up. If you want your faith to be built up, if you want your faith to grow, you need to see God's provision. But understand this. You will never see God's provision if you're always focused on what you don't have. That's why gratitude is so important. Because gratitude is one of the very first building blocks that builds our faith. When I stop focusing on what I don't have and start focusing on what God has given me, now I begin to see God's provision. And when I take the little that I have and I give it over to Him, I experience not just His provision for me, but I see that it blesses far more than me, because God can take a little and do a lot. For some of you here this morning, the challenge for you is to be grateful. Right? The challenge for you is to stop looking at what you don't have and start looking at what God has provided. And as you begin to do that, what you will experience is your faith will grow as you focus on what God has given you. And for some of you, the challenge is to stop looking at what you have as just a little and start looking at what you have as something that God can do something big with. And start asking the question, God, what can you do with what you've given me? What can you do with this if I give it back to you? These people experienced a faith-growing experience because they saw God's provision. And as you choose an attitude of gratitude, and as you choose actions of generosity, you also will see God's provision and your faith will grow. I want to wrap up this morning, though, by taking you back to the beginning of this story. So if we go back to the book of Mark, we see Mark's version of this, and he kind of gives us a little more background on what's happening. So in Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 31, this is Jesus talking. It says, "And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while.'" Now, why is it that Jesus is saying this to his disciples? Well, there's a lot going on here. If you read back in the previous chapters of Mark, what you see is that Jesus had just sent his disciples on a mission. They had gone out to all the surrounding towns and villages where they told people about Jesus. They spread the good news, and sometimes they were well received, sometimes they were not well received, but they came back, and now they were tired out. And so Jesus is looking at his disciples, and he sees that they're tired, and he sees that they're exhausted. And so he says, "Come apart and rest for a while." But it's not just the disciples that are tired and exhausted. Jesus is too. Because in the previous chapters, we see that two major life events had just happened to Jesus. First of all, he went to his hometown, and they rejected him. Now think about that. What would it be like to go to your hometown, your own friends, your own family, reveal to them that you are the promised one of God and have them reject you? That's what had just happened to Jesus. And so he's dealing with that emotional struggle of rejection. And then piled upon that, he had just received word that his cousin, John the Baptist, the one who had prepared the way for him, had been killed by Herod. And so Jesus undoubtedly is grieving. He's feeling deep loss. John was probably a friend of his from the very beginning. So he's feeling this great loss. He's emotionally exhausted. He's probably emotionally hanging by a thread. And he looks at his disciples, and they are tired, and they are exhausted. And so he says, look, guys, we just got to get away. Come apart and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So pile on top of all of that, they don't even have time to eat, so they're hungry too. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. There are times when that sounds awesome. Like, I would love to just get in a boat and go find like a deserted island and just it be me for like 3 years. Maybe not that long. But look at the next verse. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. This is where we started this morning. So I started with Jesus saw a great crowd, but we didn't understand the context yet. See, that great crowd is these people who saw where Jesus and his disciples were going in the boat, and they ran ahead. So when Jesus and his disciples got out of the boat, thinking this is our vacation. A couple weeks ago, we got to go out to Oregon. Got to spend some time with our kids, and it was awesome. There's a hotel that we always stay in because it's right around the corner from where they live, and we get points and all that, yada, yada. But I was just thinking about this. If on Sunday morning we had woken up and we're just getting ready for the day, and then somebody knocks on the door, and I go and I open the door, and I'm like, who is knocking on my door? And I look out, and it's Steve. And he says, "Hey, David, guess what? We brought the whole church. They're all downstairs in the hotel lobby, and they want you to come and preach to them." This story says that Jesus saw the crowd and had compassion on them. I am not Jesus. But I want you to see what Jesus is like here. Because even though Jesus is exhausted and he's emotionally hanging by a thread, he's grieving the death of his cousin. He's dealing with the rejection of his own hometown. His disciples have been working like crazy. They haven't been eating. In spite of all of that, what does Jesus do? He looks at the people and he says, let's take care of them. Jesus' sacrifice is what sets the generosity cycle in motion. Because Jesus is willing, in the midst of his struggle, in the midst of his exhaustion, to still be generous, to still sacrifice of himself. That's what gets this whole thing going. And because of that, all of these people experience the generosity of God, and their faith is built up because Jesus was willing to make a sacrifice. And of course, this sacrifice here is just a small one compared to the great sacrifice that Jesus made for all of us, isn't it? You see, our attitude of gratitude begins at the cross. Even when we feel like there's no reason to be grateful, even when we can't see past what's right in front of us, we can always go back to the cross. And we can always be grateful that Jesus was willing to sacrifice there. That he was willing to give his entire self away for us so that we would have the promise of eternal life. And if that's not a reason to be grateful, I don't know what is. But that's also where generosity begins, isn't it? Because that was the greatest act of generosity in the history of the world. Jesus gave everything to those of us who had nothing so we could have everything. And because he gave us everything, can't we also give something? Jesus' sacrifice sets the generosity cycle in motion. And so this morning we want to finish our time by remembering his sacrifice.